diverse workplaces and why they use it. And I think bear in mind Mary's input about complex systems, I think age in the workplace is one of those topics which is quite a complex one for all sorts of reasons. So we're going to explore it. We're not going to try and address, well, we're not just looking at age, we're looking at all aspects of diversity. Having said that, we are going to look at 3 particular lenses. So I'm going to be looking at what it takes to create a multi-generational workplace. It's not so much about age, it's about the interfaces across the ages. Sharon's going to focus on gender, and Valerie's going to sort of really land it around an individual and how that plays out with identity for actually someone who's in the midst of all this, I suppose you could say. So that's why we're looking at this topic. So we think it's interesting for our clients, it's important, and we think it's an issue for us as practitioners. I mean, you heard Jenny talking yesterday about advocating around diversity, and as career practitioners, are we advocating enough about diverse workplaces? So that's a bit of a challenge. So there's all sorts of things that, thank you. There's all sorts of things that employers are thinking about. That's the other reason why we're interested in it, because we all work in employer settings. And my organisation, the Career Innovation Company, we've recently just published this research. So it provides a bit of an insight into what employers are thinking. So this research was looking at 3 key trends that we think are impacting on careers in organisations, and the sort of things organisations are thinking about. So the 3 trends are gig economy, and not so much gig economy necessarily as going on in the wider workplace, but actually gig economy practices taking place in companies, so things like mobility, project working, moving people around, and actually employees wanting more flexibility as well, so that side of gig economy. The other topic this looks at is automation, the impact of that, the future of work, and a big agenda around reskilling. And the third topic is diverse talent. And this is just an extract from this research, because we did some desk research, but we also looked at, we interviewed 19 employers, and we were looking at, asking them really, how is this playing out in your business? Is diverse talent something you're thinking about? What are the things that are on your mind? So you can see a few things there around the drivers, if you like, for diversity in the workplace. There's some of them, again, part of that system. Some of them are to do with policy, some of them to do with scarce skills, and working a bit harder to find people. Some of them to do with expectations around social mobility, social justice. Some employers are very minded of that. There's one there about the diversity to understand and use neurodiversity. That's coming in a lot more. And the point there about reflecting the customer base, that if your customers are diverse, you really should reflect that in your workforce. So that's a driver for many businesses. And also then a big one that we see is what businesses questioning, what do we mean by talent anyway? And that's something that in our work in careers, a lot of businesses and organisations have tended to view talent as quite a narrow thing. It's like top talent, and they've got programs that take people through the talent pipeline. But now seeing a lot more emphasis on talent in everyone, and finding potential in everyone and looking to do that. So that's another trend. And the gender shifts as well. So we're seeing there's quite a lot of drivers for this in employers, and that's the other reason why we're interested in it. So I'm now going to pass to Sharon to really hone in on the gender aspect of this. So just bear with us. But any reactions to that while we're just getting set up? We built in time for questions and comments at the end, so
yeah.
Hold your thoughts.
You mentioned reflecting the customers of diversity. Do you see any employers mapping it to their physical location? Say like their city's 30% people of color, or 50% women, or a certain percent LGBT. Like, do they have any goals around their community?
Oh yes. So sorry, the microphone won't pick you up. So your question, as I understand it, is: are clients trying to map their diversity representation to their customers in terms of percentages and targets?
But then shifting that, like when I worked for city government, they mapped it to the county.
Yeah.
I'm curious, in corporations, I'm guessing that's not a conversation, but I'm just curious.
I think what I've seen, we've done some work with rail industry, and I think they've been quite mindful of, they know who their customers are on the journeys. So I think they've done that quite a bit, if that's the sort of thing you're getting at. Yeah. So how do you map the customer profile with your workforce? Yeah.
Yes. Good. And the only other thing I would add to that is I used to work for an organisation that had a large US presence, and actually I noticed that done more in the US part of the business than was done elsewhere. Yeah, so I don't know if there's more push in the US for that, but I haven't seen it done so much here in the UK.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on some of the research I've been doing around the careers workforce, and that's one of the issues that we've got, that we as a profession do not reflect the client groups that we're working with. And it's something that we need to look at, and that's across the board. It's slightly better in the adult sector, but actually in other parts of the sector it's actually quite weak, and we're a very homogenous workforce, so we need to look at.
Yes, indeed, indeed. All right, I'm going to take us into the presentation. We've got some carefully scripted timings, which I don't want to fall behind on. So I'm going to kick off and talk through barriers around gender. So just a little bit about me to start with. As you know, I'm Sharon Peake. I'm an occupational psychologist, and I focus on two things: gender diversity and also careers, both coaching and consulting. I've worked in private industry for 20-odd years, largely in HR teams and functions, and now I run my own consultancy, Shape Talent, which is around getting significantly more women into senior leadership roles in business. I'm going to take you through some research that I did a couple of years ago, back in 2013, and at that time I was the Global Head of Talent Management for a FTSE 10 business. It was a very male-dominated industry. It was a large organisation, 70,000 employees globally, male-dominated, and whilst we had good female representation at junior management, middle management, we had very poor female representation at senior leadership roles. And we wanted to investigate why. We wanted to understand what was stopping women. We didn't get the narrative that we were hearing in the organisation at the time, that women just didn't want to do those roles in that business. It was a blokey business, and they didn't want to do those jobs. I didn't buy that. So we set about doing a piece of research. We started with quite an extensive literature review to see what we could learn from other research. And off the back of that, we created a theoretical model. We then took that model and we tested it against the business, and we validated it globally. We went from Europe to Asia Pacific to Latin America to Africa, which is where most of our business was, to validate that model. So I'm going to take you through that model today. Mindful that it was performed in a big private sector organisation, so that's the reference point here, and the reference point is also senior levels of leadership. But I think a lot of the barriers and a lot of the themes that we come across probably have resonance too in smaller organisations, and perhaps also in the public sector, but you be the judge of that. So here's the model. We found there were three types of barriers that were stopping women from reaching the most senior levels of leadership in our business. At the top, we found societal barriers. We also found organisational barriers, and we found barriers at an individual level, so the things we ourselves as women might do to hold ourselves back. And I'm going to talk through each of these. I'm going to focus mostly on the organisational and the individual barriers, which is probably a bit more relevant to this audience. But I'm going to start by very quickly taking you through the high level of the societal barriers so you can get a flavour for what they were. So we found very much around the world that societal norms and expectations, particularly around the roles of women when it comes to child rearing, had a huge impact on careers, a huge impact on the way women see themselves in relation to the family, in relation to careers in general. So for example, in some of the countries in which our business operated, you couldn't get paid childcare from society. So if your child was under the age of 5, there was no creches, there were no nurseries, no childminders. Just wasn't a possibility. The expectation in society very much is that the mother would stay home and be the child primary caregiver until the age of 5. And of course we see that in other countries too. We see that in parts of Asia, we see that in some parts of Latin America. So that obviously takes women out of the workforce, out of their careers at quite a critical stage of their career. The other thing we found, and this was a major barrier in some of the literature that we reviewed, is this thing called the double burden. So if you add up the number of hours you spend every day on domestic responsibilities, so think housework, think home admin, think anything to do with children, school drop-offs and pick-ups and bedtime, bath time routines, all of that. If you add all of that up, let me ask you a question. How much time do you think you spend a day doing all of those things? What do you think?
3 to 4 hours?
3 to 4 hours, yeah? Anyone else?
For women or men? Or
Well, just answer for yourself.
I'm guessing it's double for women on average.
So, all right, well, let me put you out of your misery. You're close. So McKinsey did a global survey on this, and they found in Western Europe, including the UK, on average, women spend 4 hours, 29 minutes a day on all of those things, and men spend 2 hours and 19 minutes a day.
How old is that figure?
Sorry?
How old is that figure?
I have the reference somewhere. I'm thinking it's 2012, but I can check. I can give you the reference if you like. It's quite an interesting study. Yeah. And also, it took heterosexual relationships into account, and of course, you know, you've got families that aren't heterosexual, you've got families that don't have children, there are all sorts of manifestations. It just looked at one segment of society. But actually what's really interesting about that was Western Europe. So 2 hours more a day women are spending on domestic responsibilities. The figures, the gap between men and women was much wider when you went to Asia and the Middle East as well. So actually, in some ways, we've got it good in Europe relative to other countries, but it's still a major gap. And so when you think about careers, the double burden is when you're trying to juggle a career and you're trying to juggle home, and you get to a point, particularly the more senior you get, it's just hard to do it all because 2 hours or 4.5 hours of every day, you've got other responsibilities, unpaid work to do. There's just not enough time in the day. So a lot of women either plateau their careers or exit their careers or take decisions that result in them not moving up the hierarchy because of that. And then just very briefly, the other thing that we saw going on is gender stereotyping, which, as we know, happens from a young age. So one study that I read recently really highlighted this. It said between the ages of 5 and 6, something happens to children. So girls and boys at age 5 or up to age 5 think any job is up for grabs. By age 6, something's happened and girls think they're less capable of doing that. Their self-efficacy drops. So something goes on very young for children that ultimately can influence careers. And role modelling, I think, is a part of this too. Not being able to see people who are doing the careers you aspire to. The old adage, if you can't see it, you can't be it, I think also plays a role in this. So that's the societal barriers. Let me spend a bit more time now on the organisational barriers that we discovered in our work. So there are 2 categories here, culture and work norms. So if you think about kind of a normal organisational hierarchy, which is a pyramid, at the top of that pyramid, we were investigating the fact that there's fewer women. So by default, there are more men at the top. And so what you see at the top of the organisation, and this isn't just us, of course, this phenomenon exists in most organisations in most countries, you tend to have male-dominated cultures because there's simply more men at the top. And that can lead to unconscious bias in recruitment processes, promotion decisions, anything that affects career. Not necessarily deliberately. A lot of this, of course, is happening at an unconscious level. So there can be barriers that are created by the male-dominated cultures and the stereotypes that go with that. So we know that gender stereotyping often disadvantages women. A really interesting study I came across, quite controversial. This was done in 2012. It came out of the University of North Carolina. Found that men in traditional relationships, and the researchers defined that as men married to women who either worked part-time or didn't work at all, men in traditional marriages were less supportive of equality at work. Ouch. So that meant things like they were less likely to view gender-equal workplaces favourably. They were less likely to encourage promotion of women, because in a way that's not their norm, their frame of reference. So that, I think, kind of plays into some of this as well, the unconscious biases and the gender stereotypes. But the good news is, by shining a light on that, we can actually do something about it by kind of highlighting those unconscious biases and bringing them into our consciousness. We can actually start to change behaviours. And then the other thing we found in this category is the model of business that is very common in the private sector, which I've called here the unfailing availability model of business. And this is the sense that you've got to be on 24/7, you've got to be contactable. Doesn't matter if it's the evening, doesn't matter if it's the weekend, doesn't matter if you're on holiday. I have not so fond memories of being on a holiday in the Bahamas and having to dial into a conference call for the executive committee because they had a meeting and I had an input which was 10 minutes that I needed to deliver. So I needed to stop my scuba diving for the day and go and join a call. And this is a very common model in the private sector. So the sense that you've got to always be on, if you combine that with the double burden, there's just not enough time and not enough flex in the world of work to enable you to do that. So another reason why women drop out of the pipeline. Then on the other side, we found structural obstacles that stopped women moving ahead. So one of them was about not getting critical experiences that would be helpful for their career later. So this happens in several ways. One of them is through moving into stereotypical roles. So I come from an HR background. HR is stereotypically a female-dominated profession. But if you look in any private sector organisation, the communications team, the corporate affairs team, the marketing team, the PR team, they're all predominantly female-heavy. Not at the top, of course, but overall as a function. And sometimes what can happen in businesses, and it can be benevolent sexism, where men encourage their mentees to move into careers that are kind of going to be easier for them to navigate. And so maybe with the best intentions, women are sometimes advised to take on roles that actually might do them a disservice or might stop them from getting experiences that will help them. So as an example, if you want to be a CEO or a managing director or a general manager in the private sector, you need to have line experience. You can't just have come from a staff background. You need to have run a P&L. You need to have run an operations team. You need to have made pressure. You need to have made decisions under high pressure conditions. And actually you get that through line experience. You get that through going into operations. You won't necessarily get that in a staff function. So I think there's something about critical experiences that is important. It's not all about moving into line roles, even within a marketing or an HR or a communications career. There are still experiences that will set you apart from others to make it to the top, whether that be international experiences, whether it be leading high-profile projects. Sometimes women aren't putting themselves forward for these things. And the other thing that we found, which was beautifully summarised by a Harvard Business Review article about 7 or 8 years ago, was that women are over-mentored and under-sponsored. So we had no problem in our business with mentoring. We had mentoring programs for women. But actually what was missing is that when we sat down around the promotion table, around the board table to make decisions on who would be promoted, there wasn't necessarily always someone advocating for the woman. So unless you have a sponsor saying, actually, yes, I believe in Sharon, I think she should be considered for this promotion, all the mentoring in the world doesn't make any difference if no one's going to support you and advocate for you when those promotion rounds come around. And that was partly linked by the different access that we found men and women had to networks within the business and also sponsors within the business. So sometimes that was because the networking events where you might meet sponsors happened out of hours, might be 5 o'clock on a Friday in the pub, or it might be on at a sporting event on the golf course or a football match or whatever. So they weren't always things that women wanted to do, or if they were, they couldn't always do because, again, of this double burden, they had to nip off and had family responsibilities and they couldn't stay around. So there's something about networking and having access to sponsors that's actually really important. And then finally, at an individual level, we found a whole range of barriers. Now, I'm going to talk about 4. The 4 that I think are the most evidence-based, but there are whole books written on the 50 barriers that stop women from getting ahead. There's many others that you could probably add to this list, but some of them have fairly shaky evidence behind them. So the first thing I mentioned earlier is working in stereotypical roles. So I think sometimes we as women, when we're making career decisions, can make choices that might limit us later or might narrow down our options. There's definitely something about visibility. I think at a very simplistic level, there's two types of work. There's work that's visible and there's work that's not visible. And the work that gets rewarded and recognised and people get promoted on is the visible stuff. It's the stuff that people know about. It's high profile. It's mentioned in corridors. People are talking about that work. And I think sometimes, certainly the women that I've dealt with in my business career, aren't always so good at shouting about their achievements. And we found a link with imposter syndrome, which of course is not specific to women. Imposter syndrome applies equally to men. But some of the more recent research that I've read tends to suggest that women suffer imposter syndrome more often and more intensely than men. So both genders suffer it, but women kind of suffer it a bit more. And certainly in our business, we found lots of women saying in the focus groups that we ran, you know, I don't always speak up in a meeting. I don't always share my ideas. I might go to a meeting and leave without having said anything, which to me is a crime. You should never leave a meeting without saying anything and letting people know that you've got a voice and you've got something to say. Likability is an issue. So there's research studies that show that success and likability are positively correlated for men. So the more successful a man is, the more likable he becomes. But for women, it's reverse. So the more successful a woman becomes, the less likable she is, both by men and women, interestingly enough. And that's to do with gender stereotypes. So the gender stereotype is a successful leader acts in a dominant way and is decisive and driven and fast acting, whereas the stereotype for women is that women are caring and supportive and nurturing. And so when a woman steps into a senior leadership role and takes on some of those behaviours that are more traditionally associated with men, she's penalised for it. And you see that in the kind of labels that a woman might get about, oh, she's political, oh, she's a bit too ambitious, oh, she's bitchy, or she's aggressive. So we definitely got that kind of feedback in our study. And then the final thing is the belief in the career opportunities that are available. So there's been a huge amount of research done on ambition levels of men and women, and a lot of it feels quite contradictory. Some studies find that men are more ambitious than women, others find it's equal. I've sifted through lots and lots of these studies, and my conclusion when you kind of pick them apart and look at how they're constructed, and look at the more reputable ones, I think ambition levels are fairly equal. But what is definitely different is that women don't have the same belief that they'll reach their career goals. So again, this is also a McKinsey study. They found that only 25% of women who were ambitious and had lofty aspirations felt that it was likely that those aspirations would be achieved. They just felt the system was working against them. So that's kind of the barriers that we found. I'd like to think about what that means. What can we do about that? Because it's kind of a pretty dreary, depressing note. I think there's a huge amount we can do with this. I think there's a huge amount that we can do, whether you're a policymaker, a researcher, career consultant, or a career professional. I think everyone has a role to play in different elements of the pyramid. So from a policymaker and a researcher's point of view, I think there's stuff that we can be looking at that starts to address some of those societal barriers at the top. That's breaking down gender stereotypes. It's starting in school, starting in primary schools where little girls are getting ideas about what they can and can't do. Bringing in role models, which I think is in keeping with the Gatsby benchmark philosophy and ideas.
We're doing work on that.
Are you? Okay. Okay. Brilliant. So you're looking at getting role models into primary schools.
There's a whole load of different projects that are going to be kicking off in the next few weeks.
Oh, that makes my heart sing. Fabulous, fabulous. Okay, well, tick, well done you. I think there's a role for researchers to play here, because when we look at other sectors, the charitable sector has, so the private sector, we looked at the statistics for FTSE 350 CEOs, it's 3%. If you look at the top 100 companies, it's actually 6% of CEOs are female. But when you look at the top 100 charities, I think it is 28% of the CEOs for charities are female. And when you look at NHS trusts, 44% of CEOs are female. So there's something going on in the charitable sector and the NHS which is quite different to what's going on in the private sector. Now, it could just be that those sectors have got more women anyway. The NHS is 75% female in its workforce composition, and I think the charitable sector is 2/3 female in its workforce composition. But is it just that? Is there something else going on that the private sector could learn from? You know, I would love to see some studies that compare and contrast and maybe give some learnings around that. Then at an organisational level, and this is the work that Valerie and Rosemary and I do as career consultants, I think there's something about working with organisations, and this is stuff that we do, to help them see some of these barriers and change and dismantle some of those systemic barriers. And then finally, for career professionals, there's a massive amount that can be done on an individual level. So this is about encouraging women to help move them into non-traditional domains. I do have sympathy for what Jenny Bimrose was saying yesterday about the hazards of pushing women into male-dominated industries where they might struggle or where they might not be successful. I definitely have sympathy for that. But I also think with the right support, we can help make women successful. And unless we get more women into non-traditional domains, we're not going to change the cultures. We're not going to open that up for more women in future. We need to get to a critical mass. So I think there's something about encouraging those pathways. There's something about building practical skills, whether it's resilience, networking, political awareness, confidence to speak up in meetings, very practical skills that can serve women well in their careers. Is encouraging them to put themselves forward for jobs. So I've worked in and around recruitment for over 20 years. It doesn't matter, at least in the private sector, if you meet 100% of the criteria. But actually women won't put themselves forward if they don't meet 100% of the criteria very often. Men will. So encouraging women to say, actually, yeah, there might be a bit of a gap, but why don't you go for it anyway and see where you get to? And finally, also connecting women with role models. So that's my speed review of the work that we've done. We are going to take questions at the end, but in the interest of keeping on track, I'm now going to hand back over to Rosemary to talk about age in the workplace.
Oh, wrong thing. I've got two things in my hand there. Right. So, I know I've got people in the audience who are very interested in the topic of age. As I said earlier, I'm wanting to talk a little bit about multi-generational workplaces. So it's about age, but about the interplay of ages. And I think it's an interesting topic for us as career practitioners. One of the things I often find interesting is that, you know, when we introduce ourselves, often we say, well, I work with young people, or I work with, you know, people who are between jobs, I work with, you know, we sort of define our work about the client group we work with, don't we? So that's saying something about how we look at different age groups. Or I work with adults, and that's, I always find that a funny expression, I work with adults, well, that's everybody, isn't it, really? Anyway, so I think it's an interesting topic. It's also an interesting topic because a lot of career theory is about the life stages, isn't it, and how we evolve, and that's what we were talking about in our session before lunch, the Geronto guidance. So, and the other thing that's interesting about it, like any of this work we're in, career is very complicated, and there's so many other disciplines touching on, you know, you've got the science of gerontology, who are looking at the process of aging, you've got neuroscience, looking at changing the way we think about age, social psychology, supply psychology, you know, there's just all, you know, you could spend weeks looking at the literature about this. So I think it's an interesting topic. Now, I'm not an academic, but I have done a bit of digging around looking at some ideas for this session, which I thought were interesting. And I'm hoping that it might stimulate those of you who are more on the research side to think about, are there new ways we need to conceptualize the idea of multi-generational as opposed to looking at separate age groups. So I'm hoping that will be of interest. So Mary was talking, wasn't she, earlier, about what's the master narrative. So what is the master narrative about Gosh, missed that one, didn't I? What's the master narrative about the way generations play out in the workplace? And there is a very strong master narrative about generations in the workplaces. And it seems to be around the idea of generations being distinct cohorts. There are distinct cohorts, which, you know, this table is pretty typical of the way the generations are characterized by, you know, a set period in history, a set period of time. The idea is that if you belong to a particular cohort, you know, it's something to do with the experiences, the collective experiences of that generation, which are unique to that generation. And, you know, we've got used to the idea of grouping people by generations, and it's a cohort approach. I'm sure you'd all recognize this, the way we think about it. And what that has led to my mind, is that these broad groupings, you know, are a little bit problematic. And what it's particularly led to is, at the moment, we have a huge amount of millennial bashing, do we not? I don't know if any of you are millennials here, but, you know, this master narrative is all about, I mean, this quote here, millennials are spoilt, full of themselves, averse to hard work, and expect success on a plate. What does that mean? What a damning comment. Now, I think that was in the Daily Mail, I have to say. But, you know, that's not untypical. Ipsos Mori's research looked at 23 different countries to ask them to describe millennials. And the words associated with millennials were tech-savvy, that's the stereotype, isn't it? Materialistic, selfish, lazy, arrogant, narcissistic were the most popular adjectives associated with millennials, whereas baby boomers were respectful, work-centric, community-orientated, well-educated, ethical. So these are some of the sort of stereotypes that are pervading the narrative about generations in the workplace. And my goddaughter recently sort of struck me. She said, well, you know, us millennials, you know, it's like, because that public narrative, you know, it permeates into how people start to see themselves, nevertheless, the narrative. So it's an interesting topic. There's a researcher, I don't know if you know of her, Jean Twenge, who's an American. She seems to think she's come up with some personality differences between millennials and Generation X based on a personality measure, which has partly fed this idea of millennials being narcissistic, because she found some differences. But to me, it seems like there's some problems with this. There's some problems with generalizing about older people, you know, the baby boomers. It is not, you know, millennials are not a homogeneous group, nor are older groups. That's a problem. And there's also big differences between Eastern and Western economies in this area. And there's definitely a fuzziness around, you know, where are the boundaries anyway? How do, you know, if you're an older millennial, you're nearly 40, so it doesn't feel quite right. And also, there are not enough longitudinal studies which are looking at what these cohort effects actually are as they come through. I don't know if you'd agree. So that's the sort of master narrative. And I think another way of looking at this, which makes, you know, I think is more realistic, is that, yes, there's the cohort effect. You know, you can look at different generations through the cohort, you know, lens, and that's about key experiences, key technologies, often that people associate with. But there's the period effect of, you know, what's actually changing more generally that's affecting all the generations. I don't know if you can think of something. What would you think of that? We've all sort of moved in the same direction. Could you think of something like that? That everyone's attitudes have changed over time. What would? Brexit. Brexit. Yeah, that might be one.
Homosexuality.
Yeah, I was thinking more along those lines. So just, you know, maybe civil marriages. You know, there are some things that have changed, and all generations have changed at the same time to a lesser or greater extent. So that's the period effect. And then, of course, we've already talked about the lifestyle effect, which is to do with changes that happen because we're aging and getting older, or we're more mature and we've been through the life cycle, we've had children, whatever it is, which we're familiar with. So those are some of the things to think about, I think, in this. And then I also want to just challenge some of the myths that do exist around generational differences. And this is based on I've put the references at the back. So, and this top one is really of interest to us, I think, because when you really find out what brings people to work and what's important to them, there's a lot of similarities across generations. So that's about exciting and challenging work, meaningful work. It's about need for autonomy and freedom. And this third point, psychological stability, this came up, I think maybe it was you, Sharon, actually. Yesterday you were talking about young people going into the workplace still wanting to feel that sense of, I know where I'm going, I want the ladder, even though it seems to be counterintuitive to what people say about millennials, wanting to do variety and job hopping and so on. And the other point is that millennials do not job hop. In fact, some research I found from the Resolution Foundation showed that millennials now have actually been in tenure for more than people of the same age in the past. So it's all familiar stuff, isn't it? Do older workers always struggle with technology? Well, no, they don't. They may be a bit slow on the texting and things like that. And the other thing about millennials being lazy is that this is a period effect. Actually, most people work less hours than they did. It's one of these things because terms and conditions have changed and we have reduced our hours. So that's a difference. So there are a lot of myths. And the thing I wanted to introduce now was something about how we might theorize about this. And this links again to stereotyping. It links to Mary's systems theory. So social identity theory, is that something you're all familiar with? Social identity theory. It's quite an important theory for this context. So social identity theory is the way that stereotypes develop because we get our social identity from the groups we associate with. And when Wendy was talking yesterday about when you look on her daughter on Twitter, she described herself, wasn't she, as a surfer or whatever. So I might describe myself as a career practitioner, a mother, a northerner. These are the sort of groups that we feel we belong to. And one of the things that happens with social identity theory is that we become very embedded to the social group that we feel we belong to. So, dare I say it, Brexit and Remainers is a very good example of this. So people dig their heels in more and more about which group they feel they belong to. And the other thing that happens with social identity theory is that you reinforce the differences because you're boosting your own sense of yourself. You reinforce the differences and you minimize the similarities. So that's how it works. So what's happening in the workplace, to my mind, with generational differences is that this stereotyping going on and the reinforcement of the differences rather than bringing together the similarities. Does that make sense? So it's quite important. Have any of you come across symbolic interactionism? It's another sociology theory. So my background's in sociology. So this is about the labels we attach to things, as Sharon mentioned. So it's part of the stereotyping, but it's to do with our interactions. So we get meaning from our interactions through the labels we attach to things. So my son recently, it was interesting, he went on a session where he was doing a bit of a booster for his maths. And I was telling Nathan about this, I sent him off to this session, it was all week. And he goes to our local school, which is very diverse, and he went to this place in Chelsea. So he said to me, Mum, he said, oh, they're all white there, they're all white people, and then he said they all have the latest mobile phones, and when he got talking to them, they're all going on 4 holidays this summer. They were a very different group that he wasn't, and those labels attached to the phones and what they were doing was a good example of this. So the point about this is that these labels that we attach then limit our ability to mix and to socialize and to move across the boundaries of different groups, which is why I'm linking this to identity. So it's quite an interesting one, I think. And the third one, careers, life stages, is really what we know a lot about. And I'm going to hold fire for Valerie's going to talk a bit about this in a minute. So what can we do about this? So employers are doing quite a lot about this, and one of the main things that comes out of the theory about social identity and symbolic interactionism is the most important thing is to help people integrate with each other. It's about the interaction. So the more you bring people together, and get people to do things together, the more you break it down. So good examples of that in organizations are the reverse mentoring programs, which I think people were talking about that yesterday. So you're bringing generations together to work on something collaboratively. It could be working on projects. So a lot of companies and organizations are doing that. They're consciously planning it so that it's bringing generations together. Others which are about increasing participation in the workplace, so returner programs. So, actively bringing in someone who's had a break, who's maybe a bit older, into the workplace and supporting them. The sort of flexible working as well encourages more generational working if we're going to be working longer and so forth. And Barclays, I think others will follow, Barclays Bank have introduced an apprenticeship for over 50s, which is a great innovation, isn't it? And as Sharon was saying, a lot of it is about unconscious bias and really looking at processes. And the other thing that we've talked about at the conference is how you have these conversations. We talked about this morning, how you support conversations about career. It's really important. Building the employee voice, that's happening a lot. So GTR is a company we work with, that's Grovia Thameslink. They have employee groups. They bring together interest groups that they can come, that on all sorts of topics to just bring people together. And someone was talking this morning about the menopause workshops. I thought that was interesting. The company that's running menopause workshops, and the men come to them as well, because that's about aging and understanding. And so that was a good innovation. And then supporting people with their careers. And I think this, I was really struck with this. I don't know if you can see it. It's Sky have got their signature now on, which is obviously part of their proposition. It says inclusion at Sky. Making Sky a great place to work for employees, be yourself. And they've got a thumbprint there. And I think that's really neat. So that's another way of an employer saying, look, everyone's important here, everyone's got a place. So I think that's my bit. I have some implications, though, as well. I forgot about that. Well, I think it's similar to Sharon's, really, about legislation impacting. Taylor review on good work is helpful about what is the good workplace, about respecting in different generations. I do think there's room for some more research on this, if any of you are up for that. And I think as career professionals, it's a bit like John Amici was talking about yesterday. Our own unconscious bias and our own views about age are factors. So how we respond to people, how we treat people, our expectations of people, our own social identity categories come into play here. So I think that's really important. So I'm going to pause, and I think we're going to switch off the